So I guess you guys have heard about this little exciting thing that's going on with the Hippopotamus tank, so it's exciting stuff. Well, my name is Jeff, and I am the president of the San Diego Marine Aquarium Society. We are the club that is hosting this event, so I want to thank you guys for coming. I hope you're having a good time. So are you guys enjoying the show so far? All right, that's good. Well, it is my pleasure to introduce Eric Cassiano. He works at the University of Florida Tropical Aquaculture Laboratory.
It is tough to say.
That is a mouthful.
A lot of institutions are like that, absolutely. So thank you, Jeff. Thanks, Dave. Thanks to the San Diego Marine Aquarium Society for having us come out here. MACNA looks great. The booths look great. The town and country looks nice. I slept well last night, so it is going quite well. Like Jeff said, my name is Eric. I'm going to talk to you today about captive breeding Pacific blue tangs, but more importantly, about sharing information from facility to facility, and that's how we came to have this success. First of all, I need to introduce the team at the University of Florida's Tropical Aquaculture Lab. Our director, Craig Watson, he's very hands-on director, so he was always dabbling and always messing around with the tanks when we were having this success. And without him, of course, none of us would be there. Dr. Roy Yanung is a veterinarian, and he has an on-site diagnostic laboratory, which is a very useful tool if you're growing fish for broodstock or larviculture or grow-out purposes. Anytime we had a problem or an issue or anything that we thought was suspicious, we could just walk down the hall 50 feet and say, hey, Roy, come take a look at this, or hey, Debbie, come take a look. And for them to be able to diagnose problems right off the bat and not have to wait any time at all is extremely helpful. Dr. Matt DiMaggio, he examines fish reproduction at the lab. That includes freshwater fish and saltwater fish, so all the work that we do and all the work that's encompassed in Rising Tide falls under his umbrella. One of his grad students, Shane Ramey, who's pictured here, his dissertation is focused on freshwater fish and masculization of rosy barbs, but he helped us out during this trial, and I can't emphasize enough how much of a team player Shane is, and Kevin as well, and the rest of the team, and how important that is to succeeding when you're trying to grow these difficult to rear fish. You need people there all the time, every day, and willing to sacrifice holidays and all that sort of stuff, and come in at hours that are not conducive to family life, but that's what needs to happen, and it's carrying a bucket. It's not super complicated stuff, but that's what needs to happen is hard work and dedication, and Shane really exemplifies that. And then, of course, my partner in crime over there, Kevin Barden, who used to do the broodstock at the Tropical Aquaculture Lab. He was a broodstock manager. He's since left for private industry, and so we're looking to replace him. If you're interested, come talk to me. And I do live feed production at the lab, and we sort of co-larviculture. And again, it's that team dynamic which really works. I sort of had these crazy off-the-wall ideas, and Kevin tends to be more conservative, so it always tends to be Kevin pulling me back and me dragging him out. And so that sort of team dynamic really works well, and that's really what you need, this compromise when you're trying to grow these difficult to rear fish. We're all a part of a larger group, of course, Rising Tide Conservation, which was started by Dr. Judy St. Ledger in 2009 through the SeaWorld Parks and Entertainment Initiative. She's since gone on to be a nonprofit, and she's over in the room over there. Judy? I was going to say go see her at her booth, but she's here, so you can drag her out right now and talk to her after the talk about what Rising Tide is. I'm going to say it in a nutshell. It's a bunch of stakeholders who are research facilities like ourselves, and also industry partners, many of whom are here today, and also public aquariums. And then there's one other aspect of it. It's the home marine enthusiasts such as yourselves, getting involved, dedicated to the captive breeding or developing captive breeding protocols for marine ornamental fish, and more importantly, sharing that information. And I can't understate how important it is from the home aquarist that a lot of the tips that we've gotten over the years have been from home aquarists. So never underestimate the stuff that you're seeing in your tank. If you have a breeding pair of cardinal fish or whatever, it is important, so come tell us about it. So a year ago, or a little more, Dr. Chad Cowan, who is director at the Oceanic Institute at the Hawaii Pacific University, and Dean's here today too, actually. He was a part of that group that grew yellow tangs. And that was a big accomplishment. And they are also a stakeholder in Rising Tide. We've known Chad for years, and so we would have phone calls prior to their success about what's going wrong. How come we're not succeeding? What is happening at your facility? What is happening at our facility? And a lot of these questions we really didn't have answers for. It was a lot of, I don't know what's happening. We would have cyclical success. Sometimes we would be successful. Months later, we would be not so successful, not even getting them to starvation, having really no clue what's going on. And then, of course, once they did strike gold and had success, we said, Chad, you got to give us a call as soon as you come down from your cloud for being a rock star. Let's have a talk. And that's what we did, and we talked, and it was a lot of, I don't know what I did. I don't know what happened, and that's what Chad was saying. So Craig thought it was in our best interest to send someone out there. We thought this was a horrible idea. Why would we want to go to Hawaii? That's absolutely horrible. So Kevin got picked to go. I think he paid Craig, but it's hard to say at this point. So ceviche, Mai Tais, and following Chad Cowan and his group around learning how to grow yellow tangs. It was horrible. He had a horrible time. It was absolutely horrible. This was a great opportunity. They came back, or Kevin came back with some ideas, some things that he wanted to implement, some changes that he wanted to make, or that we all wanted to make, to try to exemplify what went on at Oceanic Institute so that we could grow blue tangs at our lab. Some of the changes, we were already leading in that direction, one of them of which is a larger larval rearing tank. Very quickly, our room is on the right there. I'm sorry, on the left. And the largest larval rearing tank is 210 liters. That's what we had before. We had 6 of those, 12 125 liter tanks, and I'm not going to convert that to gallons. I can't do that, so you can do it. And like 18, 13 liter tanks for the grad students to play with until they become good at larval rearing. Right, Liz? So, and then of course we got these 1,000 liter tanks, and you could see how much bigger they are, and you can just visualize that in your head as well. But we were already leaning in that direction. So one of the other things that we were looking at was a higher water flow, a higher exchange rate of water. We knew that they could handle, the blue tank specifically could handle a very turbulent environment. We had done aeration studies with them before and aerated them to the point where they couldn't even feed. They were just tumbling over and over again, and that's not good, of course, but they did survive to starvation. This is crazy stuff that I do, really. But they were able to survive it, so we knew that they could handle that sort of internal environment within the tank of being knocked around or even having an area where that high flow is occurring, and I'll show you that in subsequent slides. And then, of course, if you do live feeds, then you know if you have a bigger tank and a higher water exchange, then you're going to need a lot of food. You're going to need a lot more food and a lot more often. And so what we did was we actually implemented what OI was doing in terms of the Nauplii production of their NOPs. And so we implemented that at our facility, and even went so far as to get a strain of the Parvicallinus species copepod that they have at their facility. And so that's what we got. We really just wanted to cover all the bases and make sure that we were well equipped when the fish started spawning. And then, of course, as soon as Kevin got back, we got a big spawn. It was one of the biggest we had. It was like 30,000 eggs, and we had nothing to feed them. We had no tank to put them in. And all of you know, because you all deal with marine animals, is that they don't really listen to what we want. And when they're ready to spawn, we're not ready. And when we're ready to feed them, they're not spawning. It's awesome. It's wonderful. So timing is very important. And then, of course, once we did implement these changes, they didn't spawn. There was a slight water quality problem in our broodstock, so we went 2 to 3 months after having this of not spawning. And Dean, you know how it is to throw away NOPs. It's not very much fun. So this is our broodstock. I'll talk very quickly. Now, this is a lot of fish. This is not the broodstock trio that we got eggs from. These are a new group that's coming up. But I wanted to talk very quickly about the broodstock. So we did get our eggs from a trio of broodstock that are in a big 500-gallon tank. It's 1 male and 2 females, and they're about twice as big as these guys, so they're quite enormous, and they're very electric blue. They're very beautiful. Look, I love those fish. They are awesome. It is also worth mentioning that during this trial and since then, we have fed them LRS's Fertility Frenzy. That is their broodstock diet, and that's definitely worth mentioning. So finally, the algae is up to speed. The copepods are up to speed. We're getting nauplii every day, and we get a big spawn. And we're excited because we're ready for this big spawn finally. Actually, it was 2 big spawns sandwiched by, or in the middle was a small one. So the first night we got 23,000 eggs, and we thought, great, wonderful, let's put them in the 1,000-liter tank. And then the second night we got 2,000. Oh, all right, let's just throw those in there as well. And then the third night we got another big one, 25,000. And Kevin comes in and goes, oh, how much food do you got? Because we got another big spawn. And I said, I got just enough food to feed that one big tank all day long. So throw them in the big tank. And that's exactly what we did. The big tank was 1,000 liters, like I said. The flow rate was 10 liters per minute, which turns out to be about 15 tank turnovers per day, which is actually kind of, and you'll see it here in a minute, it's kind of a high turnover, and it's kind of a lot of water movement going on. We had moderate aeration. Now, that's sort of converse to what I told you earlier. We actually didn't want that heavy aeration to combat the high water flow. We didn't want to have a bunch of different currents going on in the tank. We had a downwelling current, and it went up the other side of it went up the back side of the tank, and so we really didn't want to mess with that. So the aeration was just sort of off to the side. It was really just supplemental oxygen to the fish. We had a single point source light, and that was really just what we had. It was by accident. We had a light, we drilled it to the ceiling right above the tank, and that was it. It really worked out, though, because it allowed a lot of different light gradients within the tank itself, and you can actually see the fish choosing different areas of the tank as they develop, as they're feeding, and when they're not feeding, too, to hang out in those different light areas. Some of them of which are very dark. Actually, you can see on the top right there, that bucket sitting on that PVC makeshift stand that's over the tank that actually is usually full of 3 buckets, and it's really quite dark right under there, and we would see them hanging out there quite a bit. We had 16 hours of light and 8 hours of dark. Not all those 16 hours of light were food in the water with that high water flow. There was a lot of time when there was no food in the water, just given the time to cruise around, tank, pick stuff off the wall. Maybe good, maybe bad, we really don't know. Water quality, 28 degrees Celsius, 34 parts per thousand, and oddly enough, we had an elevated nitrate in the system when this was going on. So here's what we fed them, and it was actually quite a lot. And we really, and I have to say, we really don't know what worked and what didn't work, and we're sort of still teasing that out. We fed them Parvicalnus nauplii, which was sieved below 75 microns for the first 40 days. May or may not have needed to do that. We didn't really want to stop because we're very superstitious, and what's working, throwing it in the tank, you don't want to stop doing that. Started to feed them rotifers right out day 12 from different size sieves. At first it was 100 microns and down, and then we went on to 125 microns and down, and then we just started feeding them larger rotifers. This is L-strain rotifer, by the way. When we started to feed them the larger rotifers, we also started to feed them microdiet at that time, and eventually just moving to Artemia. There was a point in time, day 30's on, when we were just feeding them everything, Parvicalnus nauplii, rotifers, Artemia, microdiet, leftover peanut butter and jelly sandwiches that were in the lab, just anything. We didn't want them to die. We didn't want them to stop feeding. We didn't know what was working, but we knew something was working, so we were very happy about that. Fed them 3 times a day. 9 in the morning, noon, and then 4 p.m.-ish. I put ish there because you know how it can be sometimes. Also shaded it with Tetraselmis 2 times a day. It was during that morning feeding and then the late p.m. feeding, and that's when we would shade with Tetraselmis. And then as you could tell, the last feeding was 4 p.m., but the lights didn't go out till almost 11. So there was quite a bit of time when they were actually in the water with the light on and not feeding. And I actually think that might be advantageous, but we still really don't know. So let's talk a little bit about larval development. What you're looking at is 5 days post-hatch on the top and 15 days post-hatch on the bottom. 5 days post-hatch. At 6, they're going to starve and die if they're not eating. So really what we're looking for at this point in time is just food in the gut. And so we're very happy to see any sort of food that they're eating, and we're just content to move on at this point. 15 days post-hatch, right below that, you start to see these ventral and dorsal spines develop. And really, these guys are very active at this point in time, finding water flow, hanging out in the water flow, and picking off food as it moves by them. They're very, very active larvae. Next set of photographs is 19 days post-hatch on the top and 27 days post-hatch on the bottom. Starting to really see the development of those dorsal and ventral spines. It's actually kind of neat. They grow these spines initially, and then it seems as if the body just sort of grows into the spines. Also, something that we noticed during this time is that they really use the spines to move around in the water. It's kind of nice to see them turn on a dime, use the spines as they're moving around through the water to not necessarily go forward, but just turn and move. Very interesting. So something I want to say is that the next 4 photographs, or 3, sorry, are from dead larvae. When you have blue tangs that are living 25 days old, you don't want to sacrifice live larvae, and we didn't want to pull them out, take pictures of them, and try to put them back. So a lot of what you'll see is dead. And you can really barely tell. A lot of them really died in the morning, and that's when we would do our sampling. But it is worth noting, if you look at the top picture here, 19 days post-hatch, that larvae is just beginning to go through flexion. So those hyperal plates are starting to come down, the notochord is starting to bend up, and that will eventually become the tail. And then you see below that, at day 27, that tail is fully formed at that point in time. And this is something that we really see with our live larvae. You can tell the swimming behavior changes. Right around day 25 is when they're going to go through flexion, and you do lose a lot of larvae during that time. It's very stressful. It's hard on my family, so unfortunately. So here we're starting to see a little bit later stages, 29 days post-hatch, 33 days post-hatch on the bottom. Some of the things to note is that that fish is really growing into the spines now. They really deepen. They don't go wide. They really start to deepen and get long. Very beautiful, fun to watch them die. You started to notice a little coloration is starting to occur, especially on the caudal peduncle there. On the top one, you can't see it so well, but by day 33, it's really starting to darken. And then by day 46, and you can tell here now that we're able to take them out of the tank and photograph them and put them back. At day 40, and I'll talk about the coloration change in a second, I sort of skipped that, but at day 40 is when, I don't want to use this word, but they settle. All right, I hate that word, but we really notice them go down to the bottom and start to associate with structure at that point in time. So this is day 46. So the one on top is, you start to see that coloration on the caudal peduncle and also on the posterior, the dorsal side right above the eye, starting to get dark. And then by day 54, of course, that very distinct palate coloration that we're all familiar with. Here's a couple of videos. Now we're going to go back in time a little bit. So what we're looking at here is day 42 post-hatch. Can you guys see that? Yeah, it's okay, I guess. What you're looking at is the bottom of the tank. It's a GoPro, right? It's the bottom of the tank right where the flow is coming down the side of the tank and hits the bottom and then goes across the bottom. And of course, behind the GoPro is where it's kicking back up, right, the upwelling. And what you're really looking at is food in that flow, and as they're swimming in it, which is odd, well, it was odd to us anyway, they're just picking off the food as it swims by. It was really kind of cool to watch this. There is quiescent parts of the tank, and they choose to be in this very heavy, high flow area. So it's kind of interesting. I can't remember exactly how many we had at this point in time. It was like 30 or 35 or something like that. It wasn't very many. So, but they did stop dying, so that was nice. So it started to, things started to level off. So very beautiful. Of course, one of the things that you're noticing is they're not blue, right? And I would call that a functional juvenile at that point in time. For all intents and purposes, it's just not blue. And here is when we're starting to see coloration. Now, this is not the best video in the world, and I'm sorry about that, but what you're looking at is 50 days post-hatch. And you're starting to see one of the individuals here that is definitely starting to get blue. And you can see that with the naked eye, right? You can see it around the edges, on the top of the head. And then he swims over to his little buddies there, and they're not blue, right? Well, each fish is individual, and they're different. They're going to develop at different phases and different times. And also recall, too, that these guys are 3 different cohorts. So almost positive that there are some representatives from the older cohort and some representatives from the younger cohort. But even so, this change in coloration did happen over a longer period of time than it did with settlement or it did with flexion. So this did take like 10 days, quite a while, and we were calling Judy saying, what's going to happen? They're going to die. So something worth mentioning, and this is kind of interesting. Now this is day 47, and if you recall, that other one was day 46 and it was completely clear. So what we did was we colored them and then we put them back in the tank. No. What we did was we took a photograph with a flash, and then we started to get, and then this is what we saw. And so they were clear to the naked eye, but then when you used a flash, you could actually start to see some of this blue. So we only took photographs with flashes after that. There was no more. But really what it is it's the way that they lay down their coloration, structural coloration. It's more reflective. And so we're able to pick that up when we use a highlight situation. It's something that we weren't able to see with just using our eyes. And here we are, day 78. This is, I like to call it the comfort zone. You can't do anything wrong at this point in time. They were out in the vat system, eating voraciously. And as you can notice now, they have their yellow tails, which is very distinct for the species. And then, of course, starting to get some yellow coloration at the base of the pectoral fin. This is where we're sleeping now. We're going home and sleeping and not waking up in the middle of the night thinking we left something wrong on at the lab. And they're about the size of a quarter, and here they are in Kevin's hands. And so you could kind of see for size comparison about how big they are. They're cute. My kids love them. Little Dories, you know. And it was awesome. It was great. It was wonderful. At about day 40 during our trial, the guys at the University of Florida's Indian River Research and Education Center also got some big spawns. That's Dr. Courtney O's in the back there in the black shirt, and that's his group there. They primarily focus on marine bait fish, but as funding and success has become more and more prevalent, they kind of got into the ornamental game too, and they had I don't know what their broodstock is, but they have some Pacific blue tangs over there, and that's also in Florida. It's on the East Coast. It's just south of Vero and Fort Pierce. So like I said, they also got a pretty big spawn. They got 34,000 eggs. So I'm going to take a second to talk about survival, because I didn't earlier, I forgot to. We got 50,000 eggs, and we had 27 survive. So somebody do the math on that. It's 1 out of 2,000 larvae, and it's like 0.00005% survival. It's really low. These guys had 5 survive, and they're still alive, and they just turned blue, so they're doing really good. 35 and 5, and I think it's 1 out of 7,000. So that's even worse. It's really low either way. But of course, that's the way it was back with any species that you first looked at, right? And the more you do it, the better you'll get, and we'll talk about that in a second. The flow rate, they had an increasing flow rate. They started really low and got more about what we were doing. Just as the food was increasing, they did the same thing. They threw everything in the kitchen sink at them, and just as more food accumulated, that higher water flow was needed to get that out of there. So they ended up starting at about 5 and ending with about 14 tank turnovers per day. They did have a smaller tank. We had an 1,000-liter tank, and they were using a 470-liter tank, so that's about half the size. They used gentle aeration like we did, single-point source light like us, but they intended to. If you can look at the top picture there, they actually have them. They intended to have just a single light up there. And then this odd 13 light, 11 dark. I don't know how they got that, but that's what they did. And then, of course, there's your water quality parameters during the trial. So I'm not going to talk about their feeding regime because they're still sort of processing all their data as well, but I'll talk about some of the differences that they did. They did the same thing that we did, and they fed them Parvicalamus nauplii from day 0 to day 40. But they also fed them ciliates on the first day. Now, we did not do that, and they did that. Is that a good or a bad thing? We have no way of knowing. They did the opposite with rotifers. I don't know if there was a communication problem. Oh, and I meant to say, we speak with Dr. Courtney O's in his lab all of the time. They are also a Rising Tide stakeholder. And I graduated from Courtney's lab, and so did Matt DiMaggio with his master's and his doctorate. So we speak to them anyway, but we were speaking to them about blue tanks. So the minute that they got their spawn, we were interjecting all of our comments and theories to them as well. And there must have been some sort of confusion about the rotifer feeding, because they actually fed rotifers for the first 10 days and then stopped, whereas we didn't start until day 12, so they did quite the opposite of us. And then they started microdiet at day 30, and we started it at day 18, I believe. So those were the differences. But either way, they had success. They grew 5 larvae, right? So what do we want to do next? Well, we want to repeat the success. Right now, the Indian River Research and Education Center has about, I want to say 10 larvae that are 45 days old, something like that. We ourselves have, I would say, about 20 or so larvae that are right at 40 days today. And then we also have about maybe 5 or 10 that are at 36 today. And then we have a smaller cohort, which is right at day 20 today, and there's like hundreds of them. It's worth saying that those survival rates are actually higher, because we stocked 50,000 in the first one, right? But on the subsequent ones, we didn't stock that many. We stocked, 5, 6, 9,000 or something like that. So we're already doubling or tripling our survival to this point anyway. So we're getting better at it, and we don't know how or why, but it's just probably instinctual, and as we move along, we will get better at it. And what we'll do is we'll start to define and streamline some of these protocols for growing Pacific blue tangs. And then, of course, the most important part is to transfer that information to the industry guys so that they can make aquaculture blue tangs a reality. But what really makes aquaculture blue tangs a reality is the support of captive bred marine ornamental fish species, whether it's Pacific blue tangs or not. It's the consumer, so I have a train here where you start with the aquaculture product, and then you go to the fish store, and then it goes home to the home aquarium. But really, it starts at the home aquarium, and it starts at the decision to go to the store and purchase captive bred Pacific blue tangs or marine ornamental fish species. That's where the real support comes from. So I'm going to acknowledge a few people here, the rising tide stakeholders. If I were to take time to acknowledge everybody, it would have taken long time. So go to the Rising Tide webpage, and I'll give you that in a second, and you can go, or you can just go to Judy, and she'll list them all for you. Go to the webpage, look at the stakeholders. All those people had a part of this project, and there's a lot of people, many more than you would ever even realize. A lot of the faculty and staff at the University of Florida's Tropical Aquaculture Lab, the Indian River Research and Education Center, and the Oceanic Institute at Hawaii Pacific University. I wish academic institutions could just get shorter names, really, it's ridiculous. So also, and this is something we're saying, the United Pet Group in Instant Ocean, for our facility, our lab, we owe a huge debt of gratitude. It is worth saying that the fish, and also Chad and his gang has grown the yellow tangs. How many times have you guys done it now? Yeah. Yeah, how many? 3 or 4, so 3 or 4 times. So they've also repeated their success. And their survival is much higher than ours, by the way. The work that was done at OI was done with natural seawater. The work that is done with the Indian River Research and Education Center is done with natural seawater. All the water that we use at our lab is instant ocean. So we owe them a high debt of gratitude, and that is a donation from them. So if you see instant ocean, go thank their hands, give them a big hug, and they'll probably say, get off me, but it's worth it. So, the SeaWorld Busch Gardens Conservation Fund, for 5+ years, they have been funding our projects, and with little to no reward, and finally, it worked. So we feel good about that, being able to hand them something that they can use, and hopefully we can continue to get funding. Seagrass and Quality Marine for sourcing broodstock for us, the Columbus Zoo and Aquarium, Ramon is speaking tomorrow at 10, so go see Ramon's talk. Ramon and Paul were one of the first people to even let us see Pacific blue tangs. We got so much preliminary information from them due to the public aquarium collections, and so we were ahead of the game once we got our own broodstock, and once we started getting eggs. We were ahead of the game simply because of those guys, so go give Ramon a big hug too. LRS, like I mentioned before, the fertility frenzy. Nuri, Fisher, and Piscean Energetics have donated without question and a lot of time and a lot of product. Also to Dr. Tim with advice for biofilters and probiotics and nitrifying bacteria and such. So these guys are a little bit more closely related to the Blue Tang project, but everyone as a Rising Tide stakeholder definitely deserves acknowledgement. So here's my contact information, and it's a little misleading. That UF web page is not functional, so you can go to it, but it won't work. So you can try it in a month, and it might be back up and running. I don't know. Oh yeah, sorry. Towel Suite, the Towel Suite website, really. The Rising Tide webpage is there. Go to the Rising Tide webpage, look at the stakeholders. Go to the Facebook page, like all that stuff, and there's my contact information. I'm just going to leave this up here. I can also scroll back through the slides. That's pretty much it. I'm done. So thank you very much for coming and attending.